I'm very excited to introduce you to today's speakers. So as I bring them up on stage, I hope you all give them a warm welcome. Diane Flynn is joining us first. She is the co-founder and CEO of Reboot Excel, which is an organization dedicated to designing inclusive work cultures. Now, Diane consults with Fortune 500 companies, she coaches executives, and she also facilitates workshops that support and promote women and underrepresented groups. She co-authored a book called The Upside, presenting the business case for diverse workforces and best practices for tapping into the potential of women in your workplaces. Now, Diane facilitates workshops for alums at Stanford Business School and also serves as a guest faculty at the Modern Elder Academy and 1440 Multiversity. Diane, welcome to the stage. We're so happy to have you. Is there anything else that you think our audience should know about today?
No, introduce Alex and let's get into it. I would love to hear in the chat what brought you here, because we'd like to make this interactive and make sure we're addressing whatever is on your mind. So please use that throughout.
Yes, thank you, Diane. Now, joining Diane is Dr. Alexandria White. Alexandria, please tell me if you prefer Alex. I'm happy to call you that. Now, Dr. White is the Senior Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Reboot Excel. Now, she's been delivering diversity, leadership, and social justice trainings since 2005. So, she's been at this for a grip and knows what she's talking about. Alex consults with organizations on ways to create more diverse and inclusive workplaces. Now, she founded a group called SAMS, S-A-M-S, Students Affairs Moms, the largest online community for mothers who work in the student affairs profession. Now, Dr. White's professional career has involved retail banking, servant leadership, community activism, diversity planning, and higher education. So it sounds like, Dr. White, you bring a wealth of experience and a lot of different perspectives to today's discussion.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking forward to it, Meg.
All right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're going to dive into some of the questions. But again, please feel free to go ahead and ask questions if y'all have them. Send them in the group chat. If you want clarification on anything we're talking about, please feel free. I will have eyes on the group chat at all times today. All right, so the first question that I wanted to talk about, so we're talking about some of these questions that inclusive leaders really should be asking. So what drove y'all to write the book in and of itself? What was the impetus for that? Dr. White, do you want to start off first?
There's so many ways and ideas that originated with us writing the book. But since I have been working with Diane since 2020, and we know 2020 was quite a time. Many of us was battling the pandemic and social justice. And so that is where the foundation of Diane and I, our relationship started. And what got us to write the book is we've done so many workshops and trainings, and we would receive so many questions from people who might wanted to text us, or they were afraid to ask in a group. And so we thought about it. Why don't we create something tangible that these questions that people can go to, something that people can have as a resource when that provocative question comes about in a meeting or a conversation. And so it is just an array of questions that we receive from people just like you in higher ed, in corporate, in other countries. And we just picked 50. We have more, but we just picked 50 to get us started and to understand what people want to ask and what inclusion looks like for leaders. And then I'm going to see what Diane has to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And I mean, I am the person probably asking a lot of these dumb questions because I am newer to this space. I've worked with women for decades, but I am newer to the space of social justice, and I found that I was able to learn by doing a lot of education on my own, reading, listening to podcasts. I have an amazing partner in Dr. White who is filled with grace and listens to my questions and patiently tells me what I need to know, who I need to check in with in Hawaii that's from our client base. I mean, she's incredibly good about reminding me of the importance of being humane. And I guess that's where it starts for me, this work is I just feel like we all deserve respect and dignity. It's part of being human. What I've found working in the business world for many years is that that often isn't enough for people. And so we do talk in our book about the business case, and that not only is it, the right thing to do, but it is the smart thing to do from a business standpoint. And having diverse teams, having diverse perspectives, challenging opinions that maybe everyone's nodding their head about, is really the best way to impact your bottom line. And it's not just, though, about having diversity in the room. It's about making sure everybody feels psychologically safe and feels included, that they belong. And so that's really, we talk a little bit about the importance of diverse perspectives in our book, but we talk a lot about what are the ways that leaders, and we are all leaders in our own way, can create a culture and environment where everybody shows up with doing their best work.
Before we go to the next one, Meg, another reason that is a catalyst for us writing the book is that we are fundamentally different. Visually, we're different. Age, we're different. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. She grew up in a predominantly white town in Minnesota, right? And so we have different perspectives. And so what drove us to write the book is also magnifying our differences, which many of you have in your offices, and making sure that we can have debate. We can be inclusive with people from different generations, different identities. So that also was a catalyst for us writing the book as well.
Alex loves to remind me that she's a millennial and I'm a boomer, but I tell her she's a very old millennial. But she's absolutely right. There are, ways we all need to spend more time understanding each other and our lived experiences, right, and how that impacts how we show up at work.
Oh yeah. Well, and it reminds me of something we had talked about. I think the first time I heard somebody call it out was like last year on one of our summit series. Somebody was talking about how we're at a point where you have the most generations working still currently in the workplace as we've ever had, because it's not like the Gen Zers are coming up and most of the boomers are gone. That's not how that works. So I think it's really interesting that, as you're talking about these, being inclusive from a leadership perspective, ageism is something that falls off a lot, honestly. And it happens to everyone. The ignorant young whippersnappers think nobody takes them seriously. The wise old men on the mountain think that nobody wants to come to them because their advice is also super dusty and old. It does go both ways, but it is important to think about stuff like this because it's not, it still falls within the category of diversity and trying to get different perspectives represented. But I think it is something that people don't think of that often. So I love that, it's not just, y'all aren't just focused on optics. Visual diversity was the first wave. And now we are seeing more and more people that are like, wait, though, no. So I like this a lot. Thank you.
Well, it's also another statistic that I think is important to keep in mind is that by 2045, the workplace in the US at least is going to be predominantly non-white. So we know that the majority of leaders today in business are white men. I mean, that is the fact. And so if you don't know how to work with somebody who maybe doesn't look like you, didn't grow up like you, doesn't share the same religion or, beliefs as you, you need to know how to make them feel like they don't want to be a quiet quitter. We read a lot about quiet quitters, and that to me is a waste of money if you're paying somebody to quit. So I think it's an important concept for everybody, no matter where you fall in the spectrum.
Very, very true. Okay, so one of the things that y'all had mentioned was some of the more provocative questions that can be asked. It makes a ton of sense, that those would also be included in the book, because I feel like a lot of times people have questions that it's like, yes, it's Googleable, but it's, you're going to get the interwebs answer. And it also can be something that you maybe don't feel comfortable asking in general, or maybe just don't have any resource to ask this. So let's talk about this. From your perspective, what do you think are some of the more provocative questions in the book? Diane, do you want to start us?
Sure. I knew you were going to ask that. So I picked question 3, which is around, the exact question is, I want diversity in my company, but I don't want to lower the bar. Is that okay?
Oh God, I love these questions.
Yeah, it's you do have to start with the introspection of what leads you to think you need to lower the bar.
Yeah. Tell me you think diversity means worse. Just tell it.
Right.
Exactly. And so there's a fundamental bias built into that question, that hiring a woman, hiring a person of color, hiring any kind of diverse person who's not the majority in your work is going to require lowering your standards. And so we always say it's not about lowering standards ever, because that doesn't serve anyone. It doesn't serve the person you're hiring. It doesn't serve their demographic group, if that's how they think of that whole demographic now because of you. And it doesn't serve your company. You're really not doing any favors. So we really talk about be very clear about the criteria that you're seeking. Write those down. We have in our book 10 steps to reduce bias in the hiring process. And having those very clear criteria, making sure that your job descriptions are not biased. And there's a lot of gender bias. There's, we want someone who's aggressive, assertive, competitive. We want athletes. We want college athletes. I mean, think of all the people that just ruled out who may fit your criteria of being team players and high performers and disciplined and all those other things. So really, think more about how do we make sure the pool of candidates surfaces the best possible talent. And sometimes we've got to shop outside. We have a group in finance that we work with, and historically they only recruited from certain schools, certain business schools. That's changed. That has changed dramatically, and as a result, they now have their intro class, their associate class is 70% diverse, largely because they redefined the criteria and they shopped in a wider pool. So that would be how, it's more succinctly answered in the book, but that's how I would address that. Alex, do you want to pick one of your favorites?
Oh, let's see. So why this is my favorite is because I get it from both sides. So being an African-American woman working in diversity, equity, inclusion, there are some of my colleagues who do this work that tell me that I'm not woke enough, or I have assimilated to, white culture, right? I'm not woke enough. So one of my favorite questions is number 15. And it is, what does it mean to be woke? This word seems to be used in a variety of ways. And so are you woke, anti-woke? You hear it from presidential candidates, the woke agenda. It's just, everybody's awake now, right?
A state where woke goes to die.
Yeah. And so we get this all the time. And people ask us, I have been the subject of whether I'm too woke or not woke enough, being a Black woman doing this work. And so we wanted to use this question. It's kind of a teaser. We don't expand upon it. We just give the reader just enough. We also give them a resource in this question, but we also talk about the history of it, right? Because woke didn't used to be maybe a bad word now. Some people try to make it a bad word, but it actually,
it's politicized, but like an extra layer than what it actually, yes.
Exactly. And it's part of African-American vernacular English, better known as AAVE, which could also be known as Ebonics. So there's a history with this word. And so when people say the woke agenda, you're not woke enough, we allow them to say, what does that mean to you? Yeah. Tell us how you are unpacking the word woke, and do you even know the foundation of the word? And then go from there. And then with the passage of time and politicians and things like that, people are going to conjure up what it means for them. And so when I tell people, what does it mean to be woke? That's going to be something that you have to identify, right? Because my perspective of woke could be different from Meg's. Could be different from Serena's or Emma's. And so you have to unpack that. But automatically thinking that it is a negative word or that it has negative connotation, please make sure you do your research and your education on how it was even presented it into the vernacular, into our current vernacular. So there is a long way. But number 15, we give you an article, we give you also some things to consider when someone says you're just too woke or not woke enough, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's talk about how you can, let's see, I'm trying to make sure I'm hitting the questions that we wanted to hit, but if y'all have questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. I've got eyes on target there.
Okay.
We did have a question early on from the audience members. This person had asked what employers might consider something as accessible and inclusive. And this reminded me of this jogged in my memory as you're talking about definitions of things, because if we're saying we're working towards an accessible workplace, an inclusive workplace, like you have to dig in more on that, right? Like you need to know what that means to the people saying it. In your experience, what do people mean? Like, what do employers and orgs mean when they say they want an accessible and inclusive company culture?
You want to take that, Alex, and I'll add on?
Accessible and inclusive. So when I think of accessible, there's so many things. I think of brick and mortar accessibility. Do they have closed captioning in their Zoom link? Are they thinking of people's holidays, religious affiliations when they're doing job interviews? Accessibility to, are they hiring people who might be on the spectrum? Are they hiring people who might be disabled? So that's what I think about accessibility. So we think of diversity, equity, inclusion, and then A. So DEIA, which has a lot to do with accessibility. So many people are not aware of that A, but for me, it is things that companies and organizations can do to make employees, potential employees, feel welcome. And then with inclusion, I just recently did a presentation at Stanford about inclusion. What can companies do to be more inclusive, right? Let me give you some examples. A company CEO knew that mental health and taking care of his workforce was of the utmost importance. He knew that people were gaining weight. People have been stuck in their homes during COVID, gained a couple of pounds, mental health, all of that. And so one inclusive act that he did was that he sent out gym shoes, Hoka gym shoes, everybody knows what Hokas are, to every employee, because he wanted to urge them to get out from behind computer screens and little square boxes that we are in now and go out and exercise. That's an example of inclusive leadership. And then for those that might not be able to walk, who might not be able to utilize those shoes, there were other things in place for them, right? That's inclusion. That's accessibility. That's a concrete example of what companies and organizations could do. Now, all of you might not have the ability to send out sneakers to all of your employees or your direct reports, but I wanted to give you an example of accessibility and inclusion and how they work together in leadership.
I'll provide another example that I love, and this one didn't cost any money. When Jane Fraser took over Citicorp, one of the first things she did is she realized, she listened. So I think listening, and we have a number of tips in the book about how to become a better listener. She listened to her employees and found that they were really burned out from these virtual calls. And so she said Fridays are going to be virtual free meetings. You can have audio meetings. You can go out for a walk in whatever tennis shoes you own. But we're not going to have anyone on video. Very inclusive, mindful of people's burnout, their mental health. So another example of, we call it sometimes radical inclusion, like things you can do that signal how important this is to your employees. We also talk in the book about psychological safety. I mentioned that earlier. That is a feeling amongst your employees that it is safe to speak up, to challenge opinions, to have a voice. There are clients we work with where people do not feel safe doing that. They say our culture is one where we do not challenge authority. We don't ask. And unfortunately, these companies are not getting the best out of their people. They're not getting the best ideas. They are not getting the best retention because people don't feel heard. And one of the things that really drives a sense of belonging is feeling like your voice is heard and valued. And that doesn't mean that everything you say is adopted, but it means that you have a voice.
Yeah. I absolutely, that's, as I'm sitting here listening to y'all and you know, throwing accessibility into our word salad or our alphabet salad that we're getting closer and closer to. I realized we could spell out abide, which might be a little bit less clunky for DEIBA for people. So now I'm going to start that. But I think that I love this idea of looking at it and asking the question, right? And trying to figure out like, is the effort that we're making going to be useful, helpful, whatever? Is it going to do that for everyone? If it's not to say that no one can have that thing. It's to say, okay, well then figure out how you're going to handle the people that don't walk in, so they don't need running shoes. I very much appreciate this as something that it starts from a good place, but then it's like, how do you make it egalitarian? So I absolutely love this.
Can we talk about the nice question, because I love this one. How do employers identify the needs? There are many ways. A simple way is a survey, an anonymous survey. Most companies do them. They are often called employee engagement surveys, and there's lots of ways. You can go to ChatGPT and ask for good questions to ask, but it's around this feeling of belonging and of what do you need? And there's open-ended questions on those. What makes you great, and what would make it better? So that's one way. Second way is focus groups. We do a lot of focus groups with clients, and we are a third party that comes in to get authentic, real feedback on, some companies have observed that certain demographic groups are less engaged, and they will bring us in to unpack what is behind that. Is there some unconscious bias that they're not aware of? A third way is simply to walk around and ask. There's something called stay interviews now that are commonly used by companies. Those are questions people ask to make sure that their employees want to stay with that company. It might be something like, hey, what makes your job great and what could make it better? What skill sets do you have that we're not tapping into? What is one thing we could do differently that would improve your joy and engagement at work? So just having those one-on-one conversations. Most people, I've yet to meet a person who doesn't find that being asked those questions is a tremendous motivator to how they view their company.
Another way to also listen, if you can put in the chat, just say does your company have ERGs or BRGs?
Employee resource groups or business
resource groups. Anyone there, or business resource groups? Let's see.
They call them affinity groups sometimes too.
Oh, yes. Okay, so Godfrey has them. So another way that you can listen is attend those. Most companies, they have more than one. Popcorn around. See what's going on in the millennial ERG. See what's going on over in the Black ERG or the women's ERG. Or the immigrant ERG, or the moms, or the caregivers ERG.
Yeah.
We urge leaders to utilize the ERGs or the BRGs to also assess what their companies need and want, and those underlying things that they might not get in a survey or a client survey, because we all know about survey fatigue, but that's also a way to do that. Really quick, many of us, we have been throwing around a lot of terminology. There is a whole chapter in the book on key concepts, because we throw around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility, microaggressions, all of these words, and do you really know what they mean? So in the book, we definitely wanted to start with that, because Diane and I use this day in and out. Meg uses these words, but if you are on your journey, you might not be familiar with these key concepts. So I wanted to put that out.
Yeah, and I'll add on to the ERGs. If you're like me and you wondered, as an ally, somebody who doesn't really identify with that community, whether it might be a Black ERG, a Hispanic ERG, a women's ERG, a caregiver's ERG, a pride ERG. A lot of companies have them for many, many groups. Are you welcome to come? And so sometimes I've asked some of our Black ERGs, I say, I want to make sure, I'd love to come, but I want to make sure that my presence isn't in any way stifling any voices, or I have never yet heard anything but welcome arms. These should be welcome to all, I mean, unless the group is designed for a different purpose. I love going. I always feel welcome. I always learn something. I participate, and they really are a great way to form some connections and some understanding. Another thing we do a lot is days of understanding, and those are simply companies will host a day, an hour of a day. The whole company is invited, and they will bring in employees to share their experiences. And it's really just a understanding. It's a day of understanding. So we might have some of the Black employees talking about what it's like to walk through the world in their shoes, and what it's like to show up at work, and what it's like to be an only in the room. And we've had these for multi-generations. We've facilitated, what do Gen Zs want in their career, and how do they like to communicate? I can tell you it is not picking up the phone, because I have 3 of them in my household. But understanding how to communicate with different people. These days of understanding are also a powerful way to learn about the people you work with.
Yeah. No, I really want to highlight something that you had said, which was, going to the ERGs and, putting yourself in these positions and going to these places where you can learn from the groups that you are trying to assist. And I think it's really, I love that what you had said was, you want to go, so you ask, like, am I welcome or not? Because there might be certain days where some shit's going down and they don't need people that are outside of the group. They don't need somebody new. This is not the day to come, audit a course. So I think that asking that is hugely important. And then, like you said, realizing that if you are trying to be there in a position of an ally, you need to act like it. So, realizing, I think I use the house party metaphor a lot. Just because you're invited to someone's house for dinner or for a party or whatever, you don't walk in with your shoes on and kick them up on the couch and start stealing shit out of the fridge. That's not what we do, right? So please remember that as allies, and I say this to y'all as a 36-year-old, middle-class white woman, all right, I know there are plenty of places where that is not my space. And even though I want to support, it needs to be done in a way that is helpful for the group involved. So, just shouting that out on behalf of well-meaning allies everywhere, act right, please, please.
If I could say 2 things that are highly needed in this work, maybe 3, that we talk about in our book. One is humility. I say very pointedly at the age of 60 that I learn new things every day, and I have become more humble the more I do this work, because I know how much I don't know and how much privilege I've walked through the world with. Second is vulnerability. You have to be kind of comfortable putting yourself out there and asking those questions
and being wrong, being in the wrong, making a mistake.
Absolutely. And then I'd say the third element that I think is needed is grace. And we need it on all sides, because if you are going to ask questions and you're the recipient of those questions, you also need to extend a little grace that person is moving into a vulnerable space. We also talk about, don't expect everyone to educate you. That's probably why we wrote the book, was here's a little education. It's a quick read. It takes an hour and you'll get a great education about some basic concepts. Start there. And then approach someone, say, I've been doing my homework and I have some additional questions. Would you have the time and interest in helping me with some of these so that I can understand how to be a more inclusive leader, colleague, and friend?
Yeah, I love that. Yes, do your own research. We all have 2 eyes and a library card. Come on, y'all.
Ellie said empathy. Yes, Ellie, definitely.
Yes. Oh yeah. Okay, so in in the context of a globalized workforce, right? So there's a lot of people that might have worked previously in like all in-person teams, but once we went remote, there were a lot of people whose workforces looked completely different and people who are quite literally on the other side of the globe from them. So if we're thinking about it in terms of a globalized workforce, how do you advise navigating different expectations, especially across cultures? Alex, do you want to start us here?
So, as a sociologist, I love studying people and cultures, right? And when I study those, I find how much I don't know.
Yeah.
And cultural intelligence and cultural humility are key concepts that we talk about. And we don't talk about cultural competence. You know how that's a word, Meg? People say cultural. Oh, I took multicultural competency tests. I took a cultural competency quiz. We want to revisit that because you will never be competent as a white woman in my culture.
Yeah.
You might learn about being an African American, but you will never be completely competent.
Exactly.
And so we decided in that chapter about global awareness, about working with different people, if you're going to have a colleague in India, colleague in China, a colleague in Brazil, it's up to you to be cultural aware, have cultural intelligence, and what Diane said, to be humble. And what does that look like? It looks like, I know I'm working with someone who has a different time zone. English might not be their first language, or English might be their third or fourth language, right? We just can't assume.
Can we just talk about how impressive that is? Like, I barely speak the only language I've ever known. Like,
yes. We always say, and so we actually put that in the book. So reconsider ESL. It's actually ESOL, which is English as secondary other language, because English could be that person's third or fourth language, right? Yeah. And so understanding that, we talk about cultural intelligence, that helps build collegiality with people in different parts of the world. We talked about, what does that look like? Asking respectful questions, if there is something that you might want to know about a culture, have you done your research? And if that person has time, you would like to ask a respectful, curious question, being mindful of time zones, being mindful of cultural differences. If you know that your colleague is Muslim, they're an active Muslim, they pray 5 times a day, what does that look like for you? And then, of course, being aware and motivating, and to make sure that everybody feels welcome. And then question number 45 delves into cultural humility. And for the people that are on this call who have never heard of that term, it has a large presence in sociology and anthropology. And it talks about making sure that you're humble when you're learning other people's culture, or not saying, oh, all those people from this culture, I knew you were like that. But you have self-reflection, curious, respectfully curious, and that's how you build global teams. That's just the foundation. And then you get into the work, and then you can get into the project setting and the goal setting. But it's really important to understand those nuances in cultural intelligence and cultural humility.
I would add a few other things to what Alex said. Around time zones, one act of inclusion I've started doing more recently is when I propose meetings to people, I always try to propose them in their time zone. Just one step you've taken away from them in having to do all the translation. It also helps, you be mindful of, are you starting at 6 a.m. for Hawaii, which we did a while without thinking about it. Another thing is names. Culture, in different cultures, I often come across names that I've never heard, or I don't know how to pronounce them. It's okay to ask. And again, I've learned this very well through Alex, who's done a lot of teaching in the classroom. Please tell me how to pronounce your name. And it's okay to ask once, maybe twice, but write it down. I now write down the phonetics when I coach small groups. I have everybody's phonetic pronunciation so that I don't mess it up. If they have a preferred name, I write that down. I don't try to just shorten names to be easy. Try to say it, the way they would like to be. Honoring pronouns is another thing we can do. We have a resource. It's how to be sensitive and inclusive in a global setting that we will send you. It's a free document. So we put our emails in the chat. Just email us. We'll send you things to think about when you're working with a global workforce. The last thing I'd mention is I have learned a lot about different cultures and how they speak up in meetings, for instance. In some cultures, especially Asian cultures, there is more of a, you don't speak above somebody over somebody who's more senior to you. And so there are just cultural nuances. I read a really good book on this called The Loudest Duck, which I'd highly recommend. And really understanding how people like to be recognized, how they like to be rewarded. In American culture, a lot of people like recognition in the form of big public accolades. In some cultures, it's more of a quiet one-on-one recognition. So just having those conversations about what is important to you and how that's an inclusive act. We've created something called a personal brief. Here's how I like to be rewarded. Here's how I like to communicate. Here's how, and you have this conversation. It's a two-way street, so that I, as your manager or your employee, we have an understanding.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Okay, so let's move into some kind of practical advice, actionable stuff for people. What advice do you have for mid-level, either managers, people who are enthusiastic about embracing inclusive leadership, but might face a little resistance from higher ups or from colleagues? Diane, you want to start us?
I'm responding to Emma. I said I would get our free resource on global awareness and also read the section in the book, the chapter on global inclusion. So there you go. Might have a typo. So you're saying if your senior ups aren't bought into this whole notion, the way that we try to get to people who don't think this is important is we start with the business case. Mm-hmm. Because even if people don't see the humanity in it, typically leaders see the business rationale. And there are some great studies we cite from McKinsey, from BCG, from Deloitte, from PwC on how diverse and inclusive teams drive better bottom line performance. There is just no question about it. And so, again, I always go to that quiet quitter analogy. If you have somebody on your team who's quiet in meetings, they're not bringing forth their fresh perspectives and ideas, they're not fully engaged, they're checking out early, you're really not leading in a very competitive and smart way. So figure out how to get that person more engaged. That's what I would say to a skeptic. And oh, by the way, we have a whole chapter called For Skeptics, and we take a lot of those questions that the skeptics ask and give you some tools.
Yeah, I like that. And I think you're right. It really is important to figure out what's the metric that person cares about. What is the thing that, are you going to talk about how it's going to make you better able to relate to, and so less customer complaints? Is it going to be, there's a lot of different ways to kind of approach this and make a good argument for, here's why you should care about the thing you say you don't really care about. Here's what it's going to impact that you do care about. I love that piece of advice.
And so I also like the game of numbers with this, Meg. So we know that the C-suite maybe is around 10 to 12 people. Then there's the CEO. And then you have the employees, which highly outweigh the C-suite, right? There's always more employees than C-suite execs. And so when I tell people this little secret, I say, let's play a numbers game. You're a mid-manager, you want to do something inclusive, you want to try to change the culture. You got to get some allies. Mm-hmm. Get some allies or people that will buy in. And so the more and more people that you get to buy in, when you are talking to managers, C-suite, you can get things done. You gather those people, you gather the data, you seek allies in what you feel that you want to advocate for. Because once the higher ups see that there's a lot of people that feel strongly about this, and that gets you some traction. And so I always tell people to play the numbers. Get some people on your side, whether they're in ERGs, your department. If you want to advocate for gender neutral bathrooms or lactation rooms, because now mothers are coming back to the office, let's get some mothers. Let's even get some men as well to help you with your cause. And so think of how mid-managers can get that thing going. It's a numbers game as well.
I would add, we have a client who I would say overall has a bit of a toxic culture. However, we have learned there are some brilliant, wonderful managers within there. And their people are so loyal to them because they manage in an inclusive way. They are mindful of giving them days off if they've been working 4 weekends straight. They are flexible about letting you go take your kid to the doctor during the day if that's a need, because they know you're going to get your work done. They've built trust. They extend trust. So you can create a culture within your group if you're a mid-level manager. That being said, I would say that the most progressive companies when it comes to inclusion have CEOs who buy into this. They message it, they model it. And if you can get your CEO to think this is important, and we've seen CEOs change and become convinced this is important, that will have a ripple effect throughout the entire organization. And people are always paying attention to what are leaders doing and what are they saying. When they run a meeting, are they asking, did Emma, we'd like to hear your opinion on this. Are they making sure everybody speaks? Are they looking at all the squares? Are they, saying names properly? Are they doing things that demonstrate that this is important? Because if they are, that really has a domino impact throughout the organization.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we're getting some good questions in the chat thread. Keep sending them in if you want them. This next person, the question was asked in our chat dovetails nicely with our next one. Let's talk about how leaders should help themselves stay current, especially with emerging social norms, or to kind of adapt their leadership styles accordingly. So when I read this question, I was thinking more in terms of like older managers or people who have a maybe management style that just isn't quite compatible with inclusive leadership. So if we're looking at somebody like that who wants to, kind of get back up to speed, what advice would you offer them? Alex, do you want to start?
There are so many people who are in leadership positions and they feel they've got it. I'm senior VP. I'm CEO. I got it. Look, I'm running a multi-million-dollar company. I don't need any more leadership training. I got it. Those are the people that we want to target with this book. Those are the people that we want to sit back and say, this is a moving target. Being inclusive in today's workplace is a moving target. And if you want to hire the best, retain the best, then you've got to understand this is a moving target. So where do you begin? I'm busy. I don't have time to read this book. So I tell people, do it in your interactions. There's a CEO who, Diane could probably tell the story better. He wanted to learn more about the LGBTQ plus community. And so he decided to be intentional with mentoring someone from that community. We all have time to talk to someone. And so when I tell leaders I just don't have time to listen to your podcast or read your book, I tell people, make time for what you want. You make time for what you want. And that doesn't mean that you have to listen to an hour podcast. Our podcast is a micro podcast. We know that many of our listeners are busy execs, and so we purposely made it 20 to 35 minutes. If you can't listen to a podcast, what is something in your personal life that you can do? I have CEOs and business leaders who have decided to ask their teenagers in their home that they have access to, what am I doing and how can I stay current? If you don't have any teenagers or young people in your circle, what about people in the community, your synagogue, your church, your temple, utilizing touch points that you already have in your life to become a more inclusive leader and to learn about other things. Those are some of my recommendations. Diane?
I keep coming back to the word humility. I mean, Alex and I talk about this all the time. We do this work, we read every article we can find, and still I feel humbled every day. I can't even imagine what it's like to be a CEO with a million things on their plate and feel like you know everything about this, because it's just impossible. You know, now there's a whole school of thought, the newest kind of diversity focus is on neurodiversity. And
yeah, it is.
I know very little about that. This is newer to me and I'm learning. And so being willing to learn all the time. We have a CEO, the same one who sent the Hoka shoes to everybody, who for 2 weeks has been on a listening tour. And we haven't been able to access him because he's traveling the country. He calls it his listening tour. And the people are so excited to welcome their CEO for their listening tour. So I would say continue to practice humility and read as much as you can, listen to podcasts, ask questions, show sincere, authentic curiosity. And I know sometimes people say, well, how do we make sure it's not just check the box? People know when it's a check the box thing. They know when you're authentic and when you care.
Oh, yeah, it's palpable. You can tell when someone actually like gives a snit about you versus they're just like, no, this is fine. It's cool. Don't worry about it. Like, yeah, that's absolutely something you can feel. And I think that is important to watch out for and like look and see like, all right, is this valid? Is this like earnest or is it not?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. So we've got a little over 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll save a little bit of time for goodbyes. Okay. Go ahead. Sorry. I want to talk a little bit about some of the backlash that people get from this. So when I read this question, the first thing that came to mind for me was Chick-fil-A from like 2 months ago, right? Given there can be a bit of a backlash regarding corporate diversity programs, what do you suggest companies do? And in case anybody's unfamiliar, Chick-fil-A got a whole bunch of heat about, oh, there's a corporate diversity person there, blah, blah, blah. It was a post that was like a position that was filled 3 years ago, but suddenly somebody decided to make it a hot button issue. So let's talk about this. Like in terms of that kind of backlash, like what do you suggest companies do? Do you like tell them to prepare for the eventuality? Does this look so different that there's basically no point preparing ahead of time? You can just kind of stay ready. What do you recommend companies do in terms of a backlash?
Well, I've read a lot about this recently because our clients are saying we offer leadership programs often for women or women in underrepresented groups. And because of the Supreme Court law on affirmative action recently, there's been, if you've read the papers in the last week, there's been groups that are targeting and suing companies that are investing in Black women entrepreneurs. They say that some of these are discriminatory activities. There is a great resource I just read from Harvard Law that talks about how companies should be thinking about this. And I've been sending this to all our clients. I think that we have to be mindful of what we're doing, that we're not breaking laws and the laws keep changing. But I feel very strongly that we have to keep in mind there are many underrepresented groups and companies, and that often includes women, who do not have the same access to opportunity. They don't have access to networks, to mentorship, to sponsorship. They don't even know the position is open sometimes because they weren't in the room where it happens. And so the programs that we advocate and lead are to make sure that everyone's getting to the starting line so that they can compete for that job or that promotion or that. And that I think is okay. I am not a legal expert, so talk to your legal departments. But making sure that everyone has equal access to opportunity is okay. What is not okay is targets. There's disputed, our goals okay. Goals might be okay, but they can't be mandates, right? They might fall under affirmative action. It's very messy right now. I would say keep up with the papers, watch the legal opinions, talk to your in-house legal counsel, but do the right thing to create opportunity for all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Correct. Okay. And
all right.
One more.
Yeah, please.
Oh no, I was just telling people who right now who are so stunned by this backlash. But if you know history, you know this was coming, right? You know that when the Civil Rights Act was signed, there was backlash to that. You know, when feminism and the women's right to vote came about, there was backlash. And so we know that after George Floyd, there was an influx of diversity, jobs, and LinkedIn. There was a 200% increase of the word diversity on LinkedIn. If you know history, you know this was going to happen. And what happens, it's going to swing back. It's going to swing back. And so for those that are running around, just so dismayed, think of it as in a historical context. And so I often tell people who are worried about this, that this has happened throughout our history in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excellent advice all the way around. Thank you both so much. Well, great. We have 2 minutes left. I want to know, if people only take one thing from today's event, what do you want it to be? Diane, how about you?
Get in touch with your values. I look at the Target, the Bud Light, if your values are to create a culture of inclusion for people, if you value every human being in your organization, then be consistent about that in how you treat your customers, in how you operate daily. Think hard about your values and how do you live your values. That would be my takeaway.
Thank you so much. Alex, how about you? What was the one thing, if people only remember one thing, what do you want them to take with you today?
To understand that this is a moving target. Give yourself grace in being an inclusive leader, that you're not going to get it right 100% of the time, but at least you are trying. I think we're so scared to say something and do something because we don't want to get canceled. Mm-hmm. But in the event of being canceled, what can you learn? How can you be a better human? And what can you take away and pass on? So give yourself grace, and that this is a moving target.
Love it. Absolutely love it. All right, Diane and Alexandria, thank you so much to both of you. It has been wonderful to get to meet you, get to know you a little bit more, and to learn from you for the last hour. So thank you so much. I really hope we get to do it again soon. All right, y'all, for our audience members, thank you. Thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day. Obviously, I don't have a job without you, but more importantly, you took an hour out of your day to do something positive for yourself and your career. That is not easy. It is not a simple thing to do in this day and age. So please pat yourselves on the back, give yourself a gold star, a cookie, whatever your reward system is. But thank you so much for spending time today with Power to Fly and Reboot Excel. That's going to bring us to the end today, but I just want to say, if this was your first Power to Fly event, I hope it will not be your last. We can't wait to see you. For all of our frequent flyers, I cannot wait to see y'all again. I love seeing the familiar names and avatars in the chat. So thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you have a healthy, happy, safe rest of your week and weekend. And if we don't see you before then, can't wait to see you back in a little while. Bye, y'all.